Welcome to Chapter 5, Creating Web Pages, Part 2. You will be able to design and create an entire website by using codes from all chapters, structured and styling horizontal and vertical nav bars, universal fonts such as Google Fonts, inserting music and video, creating and designing relative pages, and connecting key terms in the chapter with Section 5-2, Absolute Nav Bar. Since the relative links use the nav bar, the absolute links will need an ID nav. Following the body tag, use nav ID equals nav1 to set up the absolute links. You will also need to add the target equals underscore blank. This will open up the absolute links in a new tab. This is a required code since you don't want the users actually leaving your website when they click on the absolute link. So you want the absolute links to open up in a new tab so that they still have your website open. Note, like the relative links, you have to add LI between each link that adds the spacing and the bar. The nav ID will be above the header. The nav for the relative links will be below the header. Notice that the relative links have larger fonts since these fonts apply to your actual website. The relative links should have smaller fonts since you really don't want them leaving your website. You're just providing these as a courtesy. Also note that I adjusted the size of the masthead, but more on this later. Setting up the absolute links. First, set up the nav CSS selector for both the relative and the absolute links, since both of them will use the nav selector. Since both of these nav bars are horizontal, they use the same width and height. Notice that the nav CSS selector's width and height are different. Why? By using only max width and height auto, our CSS coding is simplified. CSS coding for our absolute selector. We now have to set up the ordered list and the line items so they are unique to the absolute ID selector. So first, you're going to set up the number nav1 LI, and you're going to include the display, the color, font size, font family, and font variant. The second code you'll set up is the number nav1 UL LI, comma A, which focuses on the anchor tag for that specific nav bar. You want your text decoration, display, inline, and color. The last one that you will use is the number sign nav1 LI, comma A, colon hover. This will target the anchor for the absolute links so that when you scroll your cursor over each of the links, they will show up as underlined and change colors. Setting up the absolute links. When you're done with the absolute links, it will be similar to the ones that look below. After setting up your absolute links, then you set up your relative links as you have learned in Chapter 4, which shows the bottom. Again, notice that the relative links have larger font. Responsive web design. As web designers, it is important that we be introduced to the idea of responsive web design. We will only be introduced, thus our pages will not be completely responsive web pages. To be responsive, we need to take another look at how we set up div and image tags using width and height. This will require some changes when using responsive web design theory. The good news is that the new coding is simpler and uses less coding. In Web Design 2, it will teach you how to completely set up a web page as a responsive page. Hope you consider taking this class. What is responsive web design? Responsive web design makes your web page look good on all devices. uses only HTML and CSS coding. Responsive web design is not a program or a JavaScript. Web pages can be viewed using many different devices, desktops, tablets, and phones. Your web page should look good and be easy to use regardless of the device. Looking at this image, this device is a PC computer. Here is a tablet, and here is a phone. Notice that all of them are different sizes and widths. So in order for it to be responsive web design, you need to make sure that you resize, hide, shrink, enlarge, or move content to make it look good on any screen. For the first time through HTML5, web designers can now take over the viewport. On every page, you want to add the following code following the author's meta tag. You want meta, name equals viewport, content equals width equals device dash width, comma, space, initial dash scale equals 1.0. Name equals viewport provides instruction to the browser on how to control the page's dimensions and scalings. Content equals width equals device minus width or dash width sets the width of every page so that it follows the screen width of the device, which will be depending on the device. And initial dash scale equals 1 sets the zoom level when the page first loads onto the device at 100%. There is a lot more detail in setting up an actual responsive web page. We will cover only a few of the ideas, so in actuality, your page will not be completely responsive. By using the universal selector for box borders, you have already begun to create a responsive web page. Changing the header, nav, div container, and footer. On the website I did, since my header and nav had the same dimensions, I grouped my CS header and nav. So I have a max width, then a height auto. I also grouped my ID container and my footer, since these also had the same width and height. In the two examples below, notice that I changed the width of my images to 100% and the height to auto to make my images responsive. I noticed I changed my masthead and I changed my second image. I had two images on the page. Opacity, this is a new CSS styling. This allows you to lighten or darken an image on a page. Note the filter is needed to address Internet Explorer early versions so they are compatible. We have been working with ID divs. To be in compliance with responsive web design, we need to change from ID divs to floating boxes. We will start with the div. We will still use the div ID equal to container tag to set up our floating boxes. Floating boxes use both ID selectors and class selectors. The floating box will float boxes so that you no longer have to use the float property value. Just a note here, if you cannot use a top margin with floating boxes. Let's look at how the ID equal div1 is replaced by a class floating box in the body section of a web page. You can change all your ID equal div selectors to class selectors. If you notice, after the ID container tag, I now, instead of having ID equals div1, I have class equal floating dash box. Following the container and footer grouping for CSS, I set up the class selector for the floating box. The new codings that you probably are not familiar with is display :space inline dash block. This is like the inline element, but this one can actually have a width and a height. You add width and height to your floating box, margins, and then you can add other CSS stylings. In my case, I added a border radius, padding, and box shadow. It's a good idea to add your border so you can see how your objects are moving. You can have as many floating boxes as you want. I set up an ID floating box to apply to my second tag. The dimensions were different. So I have an ID floating box instead of a class. So I'm just showing you that you can also use an ID with your floating box. I also set up a second class selector for my third and fourth div tags called .floating box 1 because I wanted the dimensions to be different with the third and fourth boxes. So floating boxes are similar to ID divs, except you're going to use less coding. This takes us one step closer to having responsive web pages. Congratulations, you have just finished 5-2. Open up the potato chip folder inside your Chapter 5 folder in Notepad++. Add an absolute horizontal nav bar above the header. Add the appropriate CSS styling. Add the new meta tag introduced in the chapter for responsive web design. Change the header, nav, container, and footer width and height so it is more in line with responsive web pages. Then continue on the next page for further instruction. Change the images width and height so that they are more in line with responsive web pages. Change your div ID equals divs to floating boxes. Restyle the floating boxes so that they are compatible to responsive web design. Review your pages to make sure your web page is aligned correctly and it is styled the way you want it to be styled. My final page may be previewed on the next slide. No, my page does not look any different except for the fact that it is more aligned to responsive web design and it has less coding. When you finish, show me your work. Congratulations, you have just finished part 2. When you have shown me your completed work, please move on to part 3.